Today I rise to address the legislative proposal introduced by Senators Lieberman and Warner to address global climate change. Like many of my colleagues, I share the urgency to take proactive steps to address this challenge that we have. That said, I have serious reservations about this proposal. I feel that it is overly aggressive, vastly outpacing what technology can provide, and thus ensuring enormous economic pain on the country, and it is overly bureaucratic and cumbersome in its implementation, representing an unprecedented expansion of government power and a massive bureaucratic intrusion in American lives that will have a profound effect on businesses, communities, and families. The EPA has stated in an answer to a letter that I sent them, this program will take between 300 and 400 people to implement, whereas the acid rain provision takes just under 30. The major failure of this legislation is it fails to harmonize our country's economic, energy, and environmental objectives. And the consequences to American interests could be devastating. The international aspect of this problem is particularly troublesome. The developing world is currently undertaking an intensive expansion of energy infrastructure and escalating transportation, industrial, and commercial expansion to meet the demands of growing domestic and international markets. The developing nations' combined emissions shortly will exceed the developed nations' combined emissions. In 2007, the International Energy Agency issued a report projecting that global energy demand would increase by more than 1/2 by 2030. And that developing countries contribute 74% of the increase in global primary energy use. China and India alone account for 45% of that increase. China puts online 2 coal-fired plants every week. 2 coal-fired plants every week. In June, the Netherlands Environmental Assessment Agency announced that China's 2006 CO2 emissions surpassed those of the U.S. by 8%. With this, China tops the list of CO2 emitting countries for the first time, and by the way, years ahead of the projections that were made a couple of years ago. And much like China, those countries with large domestic reserves of coal, and that includes the United States, will continue to use it. And it's unrealistic to assume that the world would turn its back on this abundant resource. We must take this reality into account, and this can be done by jump-starting the technology that's needed to produce the energy we need in an environmentally sound manner. Recognizing the international dynamic of this problem, the Lieberman-Warner proposal attempts to impose a tariff-like requirement to hold carbon credits for goods entering the U.S. from countries that do not control their emissions. The U.S. Trade Representative has questioned the plan's efficacy, and China, Mexico, and Brazil have signaled that the policy could begin a trade war. Indeed, top officials from the European Union and United Nations have also raised doubts about whether the U.S. trade penalties would harm the prospects of a new global warming agreement. But even if the provision is WTO compliant, it will not address the underlying competitiveness issues the U.S. would face from the higher fuel, feedstock, and electricity prices the bill would impose on U.S. manufacturers. A better approach is needed. Americans are already struggling with the increase in their cost of living due to higher prices for gasoline, home heating fuel, electricity, food, and health care. And this bill would only make things worse. I wish that some of the sponsors would go back into their respective constituency to hear the complaints from most people, middle-class people, poor, the retirees, whose standard of living is being reduced here in the country today because of these costs. We cannot tolerate policies that harm our economy and drive businesses overseas. If those businesses locate in countries that do not share our environmental objectives, then we are worse off on 2 counts: fewer jobs in the United States and no benefits at all to the environment. And over my strenuous objections, this bill was voted out of the Environment and Public Works Committee without an analysis of the economic impacts on the country from either the EPA or the Energy Information Office. And today we have at least a dozen analyses of the bill from from a wide variety of groups, and they're all about the same. EPA's analysis predicts that by 2030, annual losses in gross domestic product could be as high as $983 billion. And by 2050, those losses would grow to $2.8 trillion. And to put this into perspective, CBO projects federal budget for this year will be $2.9 trillion. That means the potential impact losses from this legislation in 2050 will equal that spent on everything that we intend to spend this year, from Social Security to national defense. Think about it. In order to meet the caps of the bill, the analysis assumes aggressive growth in nuclear and other clean energy technologies at rates that are widely regarded as unachievable and, from my perspective, unbelievable. For example, they predict a 150% increase in nuclear power by 2050. Today, there are 104 operating plants, meaning that we have to build up to another 150 new plants by 2050. The Energy Information Office, when they did the analysis, said that we'd have to build 220 of them by 2030 in order for these caps to be realistic. These assumptions are unrealistic and mask the true cost of implementing the bill. In regard to nuclear power, I recently published a paper in the Nuclear News on the steps that we need to take to launch the nuclear renaissance. And I'm going to make certain that each member receives a copy of this paper. But bringing vast amounts of new nuclear power online, folks, will not be a layup shot. For example, there's only one country in the world that makes the vessels and forgings, and one plant for plants. And recently, when we anticipated that new plants would cost about $5 billion, the new cost is $7 billion per copy. Today, we have pending at the Nuclear Regulatory Commission 9 applications for 15 new plants that, if constructed, would not come online until 2015, 16, and 17. Honestly, we're going to be lucky to have 30 new nuclear power plants by 2030. In regards to what we call capture carbon and sequestration, the technology that's needed, no commercial experience or testing at scale has been done. DOE says it will take 10 years before the 7 large-scale demonstration tests are complete to look at sequestration. DOE says a more robust geological assessment will not be complete until 2015. Liability and critical infrastructure issues remain unanswered. And DOE says commercial CCS may not be available for 20 years. This connection between the costs of the program and the availability of clean energy technology is clear. As EIA points out, the timing of the development, commercialization, and deployment of low-emission electricity generating technologies such as nuclear power, coal with CCS, and dispatchable renewable power is a major detriment of the energy and economic impacts of 2191. I want to repeat that. The timing of the development, commercialization, and deployment of low-emissions electricity generating technologies such as nuclear power, coal with carbon capture, sequestration, and dispatchable renewable power is a major detriment of the energy and economic impacts of 2191. The Cleveland Plain Dealer, which is the largest newspaper in the state of Ohio, this Sunday editorialized on this bill, and the title was, "This Carbon Bill Isn't the Answer." It goes on to say, the bill as conceived will just bore new holes into an already battered economy. Coal-dependent states with partially deregulated energy prices, Ohio, for example, would take a double hit in economic dislocations and electricity price spikes, with barely any financial cushions to make the disruptions more palatable. The bill also lacks the kind of consumer fairness and flexibility necessary to avoid fuel price shocks and damage to manufacturing nationwide. I ask that this editorial be included in the record.
Without objection, so ordered.
And Mr. President, I'd also like to ask that this paper that I've written on the nuclear renaissance be included in the record.
Without objection, so ordered.
While coal and manufacturing states pay their neighbors and the government to stay in business, the bill establishes trillions of dollars in new entitlements. earmarks, with money flowing to over 30 new government spending programs, constituting, as the Wall Street Journal recently pointed out, one of the largest tax and spending bills in the nation's history. Based on EPA's analysis, this bill would raise over $6 trillion from the allowance auction to owners and operators of utilities and factories who have to purchase allowances to stay in business. But the cost of purchasing these allowances would be passed on to consumers as higher prices, which will, as the CBO points out, amount to a regressive tax hitting low and middle income working families. In my state, they predict that by 2012, or 2030, we will have, was it 2020, I think, 2020, that the cost of electricity will go up 50%, the cost of natural gas 80%, and the cost of gasoline would go up 30%. Now, some of my constituents say, how could the cost of gasoline go up? And I point out to them that we have refineries that refine oil. And with this bill, they're going to have to buy allowances. And those allowances will increase the cost of your gasoline 30%. Did you hear that? 30% increase in gasoline cost as a result of this legislation? Give me a break. And despite the severe economic damage Lieberman-Warner would impose on the U.S. economy, the policy would do little to address global climate change. EPA's, this is not some conservative group out there, analysis indicates the policy will reduce global concentrations of CO2 less than 5% by 2095. Addressing climate change will require a technology revolution centered on the way we produce and use energy. The theory behind Lieberman-Warner is the more painful it is on business, the faster CO2 reductions will occur. I believe the solution to this problem lies in our ability to increase access to clean energy. Instead of using the power of the government to increase energy costs, we should use it to decrease barriers to investments in clean energy solutions. The U.S. took a lot of flack from countries for our not signing Kyoto, but I'm pleased that the Bush administration has been moving forward with some new initiatives. And while we didn't sign Kyoto, we do have a base of international activities to build on. And one of them could provide the basis for becoming a multinational effort, giving all countries a vested interest in technology advancement and deployment. The thing we've got to remember is that, above all, the developing world desires sustained economic growth. Slowing down economic development to address climate change is not an option they are willing to pursue, and we cannot force it upon them. If we're going to be successful in addressing the challenge of climate change, we've got to set a realistic vision for the developing world using what Richard Armitage and Joseph Nye referred to as smart power. When they testified before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee on April 24, 2008, they argued that the world looks to the U.S. to put forward better ideas rather than just walk away from the table. This was the perception after Kyoto, and it could be the perception again today if we do not find a way to engage the developing world. They go on to say the United States needs to rediscover how to be a smart power, matches vision with execution and accountability, and looks broadly at U.S. goals, strategies, and influence in a changing world. And they rightly conclude, our challenges can only be addressed with capable and willing allies and partners. Without willing partners in China and India, we cannot be successful in addressing climate change. Technology development and promotion should drive our national climate policy. It is the only rational path forward. It is the only way to deal with emissions from rapidly expanding coal-based economies like China and India, who readily admit that they have no intention of accepting binding emission targets. The public interest and private sector communities agree that the crucial factor that will determine whether we have an effective climate policy is the extent that that policy will encourage the development and deployment of needed technology. Regulation without sufficiently available technology will result in high cost for American consumers while offering little hope that developing nations will answer the call to reduce their emissions. In conclusion, I agree that we need to act quickly to address climate change, but we must be smart about how to proceed. And I'm hoping that after this year's debate, we can come together on a bipartisan basis to draft a bill that doesn't impose unilateral actions that hurt our economy and drive jobs overseas, but rather jumpstarts technology, engages our international partners through collaborative multinational effort to develop and deploy the clean energy technologies that everyone recognizes are necessary to solve this global environmental problem. I appreciate the Chair giving me an extra minute. Thank you.
Senator from